Okay, I'm starting recording. I would like to introduce everyone to Ava Wright. Ava Wright is a assistant professor in philosophy at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She is somewhat unique in having both a strong background in AI, as most of us here have, as well as ethics. So she received a master's in artificial intelligence and JD, as well as a PhD in philosophy. Um, she's let's see, she's a former software developer and presented in several AI conferences, as well as works in philosophy journals. And in such a unique setting, I think it's a great opportunity to have her talk. So with that, I would love for you to take it away, Eva.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. It's a really cool opportunity to make some California connections because I'm still new in California. I mean, even if they're virtual connections, they're still better than none, right? So hopefully in the future, maybe I could come and actually visit you in person. That would be a really wonderful opportunity too, I think.
Yep.
But thank you for letting me present some of my work to you in this format. I'm presenting from Atlanta. I don't know if you all are in California, but I'm in there for the holidays right now. So I hope there won't be any internet connection issues, but if there are, I'm just warning you in advance, and I'll just try to make sure I reconnect if there are. Okay, so I made a slideshow here. So I'll just share my screen and get started. So this first slide is just me, which I think has already been covered sufficiently by Keith. So my background kind of puts me in a nice position to make some progress on some of these issues in AI ethics that I think are sometimes the treatments of these issues are limited either because someone's too technical or not technical enough. And I'm kind of in a good intersectional position to be able to have a pretty deep analysis normatively, both on the ethics and law side, while also having enough depth, I think, technically to be able to grapple with what's really going on technically in some of the solutions that are proposed. And I think maybe this presentation will help demonstrate that kind of simultaneous depth and breadth at the same time here. So that's me. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and proceed. So here's the title of my talk: Rightful Machines Solving the Trolley Problem for Autonomous Machine Agents. I'm thinking about changing this research program to Kantian machines, so it's instead of rightful machines. Although I think these Kantian ideas are common across normative philosophy, it's hard to articulate them without referring explicitly to Kant's moral theory and political theory. So I may change this to Kantian machines. My MS thesis was called Rightful Machines. So this is basically coming from that work and then from some papers I wrote for the AI Ethics in Society conferences of it in 2019 and 2020. And I'm writing another one actually in this series for the upcoming AIS conference. Okay. So rightful machines, I'm going to solve the trolley problem for autonomous machine agents, like self-driving cars, for example. So a general challenge in machine ethics is to build autonomous machine agents that act morally. So that immediately raises this question: how do we build autonomous machine agents like self-driving cars or military robots or even domestic care robots, things like this, that act morally, given that we have these conflicts over what's right and wrong? That's why the trolley problem has drawn so much interest, because it's a conflict case. And this is the question I'm going to try to answer in this talk. The big question. So here's the sort of 3 sections of my presentation. I'm probably only going to do the first 2 sections within this time allowed, and we can talk about the more technical stuff in the 3rd section if that's where you prefer me to go. So first I'm going to talk about what I mean by rightful machines or Kantian machines, by first talking about what kinds of machines these are not. And then I'm going to explain some basics of kind of deontological or systematic deontological moral theory, which is a Kantian moral theory. It has to do with rights and justice and how Kant thinks about those things. Just to preview that, Kant thinks of morality as composed of 2 parts, justice and ethics, and they are not coextensive. So that's really kind of how that's going to work. And then in this 2nd section, I'm going to talk about how to resolve moral conflicts that arise for machines, that might arise from machines, such as the trolley problem. So I'm going to solve the trolley problem in this presentation. And that's a kind of a really arrogant thing to say, maybe, because it's a classic problem that's been around for decades, but I believe I have done that. So you can judge at the end of this presentation. And then I'm going to talk about how the solution of the trolley problem that I proposed, it's a Kantian solution, helps illuminate how to resolve moral dilemmas more generally that machines might face. Or yes. And then the last section, as I said, is technical. I can talk about deontic logic, answer set programming, and the kind of rational agent architecture I have in mind. If you want to, if we have time, because it gets pretty complicated. So, okay, so rightful machines. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's talk about what are not rightful machines. So this experiment is pretty well known now in AI ethics. It's the moral machine experiment, where millions of people were asked online what a self-driving car whose brakes have failed should do, and its only choices were to swerve or stay on course under various conditions, like how many people it might kill if it continues, maintains course, or turns. This is the MIT moral machine experiment, and it was published in Nature, and it's gotten a lot of attention. And I could show it to you, but I'll just I'm sure you're probably a lot of you are familiar with this. But these are the kinds of scenarios that they present subjects. So there's the self-driving car, and it can either go straight or turn left under all these different conditions. So if it goes straight, it kills 3 people in this case, three men there. Actually, 2 large men and 1, I can't even read. My screen is too small to read, but 1 woman, I think. And if it turns on the right side, kills 3 women, I guess. So, so subjects were presented with lots of these scenarios in order to sort of aggregate their ethical preferences as to what they think the car should do in these various situations. So here's a new situation where now it's 2 versus 2, and they're different genders, and they have, here you've got the stoplights. So the people on the left there are jaywalking because it's red, and the people on the right are legally crossing. So that's supposed to influence which choice you might make there, and then another choice. So just lots and lots of variations that they proposed to millions of subjects. And here's what they came up with. Here are the preferences that they gathered. So the characters on the right are the ones that were preferred to spare, when compared with the characters on the left, or the scenarios on the left. So there was this very slight preferences for inaction over taking action, and then you had very strong preferences, as you can see, for sparing more people as opposed to fewer people, and for sparing humans over animals. There was also a pretty significant preference for sparing those of higher status over lower status, and for sparing maybe fit people over large people, and so on. And then they found some variations that were geographic. They're kind of interesting. Like Eastern cultures tend to have a different way of different kinds of ethical preferences in these matters than Western ones. Like Eastern cultures had a little more respect for older people than Western cultures did. So that's kind of interesting. So in a follow-up paper, the authors of the moral machine experiment posed the problem and the solution in this way. This is a direct quote from their paper. How can society agree on the ground truth, the ethical principles that should guide autonomous machine agents in these kinds of conflict cases, when even we ethicists cannot? We philosophers just can't solve the trolley problem with our theory. So how are we supposed to agree on this? And they propose this solution. They say that we ought to aggregate people's opinions on ethical dilemmas in just exactly the way the moral machine experiment did. We should collect them and then program cars and other autonomous machine agents accordingly. So there's explicitly, appear to be explicitly, in this follow-up paper, they explicitly do recommend, propose doing that. So that shocked me when I first came across these papers, because some of these preferences seemed intuitively extremely, maybe even banal, but some of them seem very problematic to me, and I think to most people. And maybe this has become more obvious now because this experiment's a couple of years old now. But I mean, as I kind of hinted, it seems to me it violates my moral intuition that sparing people who are higher status over those of lower status, that seems unethical to me, as well as sparing females over males. That seems unethical, feels unethical. Now, saving humans over pets, that seems ethical to me, or morally unproblematic. Saving more people over fewer, okay, that seems, there's problems here. This seems like a complicated situation. So, I mean, this is the intuition that I think the preferences to spare the fit over the overweight, or higher over lower status, tends to raise. That if we program autonomous machine agents accordingly, in accord with these aggregated preferences, then we would fail to respect the moral equality persons. And acting on these preferences would be unjust.
Wait,
So
Ava,
this is the basic intuition.
not that good.
It seems to me that some of these preferences raise, and I think that autonomous machine agents programmed to enact these ethical preferences, and they would pose a threat to civil society. So yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. It seems that your internet cut out for a minute. So could you repeat yourself? Oh, all right.
Sorry about that. Am I back now?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
you can hear.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
By the way, while we're paused briefly, Ava, I was wondering if one of the issues about these moral dilemmas you see in these in this collective decision making, like the moral machine, is because these are hypotheticals. I'm recalling there was a study which showed that many people might be against abortion, but among people who have Down syndrome, among people who are pregnant, who discover their child has Down syndrome, something like 93% choose abortion. Assuming that that's a representative population, which I think is a fairly good assumption, that would suggest that what one says is hypothetically moral and what one chooses to do would be two very different things. So maybe one of the reasons why their preference for people of higher status over lower status and things like that could be just because these are hypotheticals and not actual actions that people are doing. Do you think that's possible?
Well, as I think it's been made clear by by many experiments done on the trolley problem in particular.
Mhm.
All kinds of things influence how people respond to these kinds of thought experiments. And you know, there's framing and ordering effects that influence how people make their choices in these hypothetical thought experiments. So you're posing a question about the sort of about the utility of thought experiments like the trolley problem, or like the one you proposed with the abortion case, and just whether, you know, whether people's answers to thought experiments really would reflect what they would do. So that's a pretty big issue in moral theory. I'm going to touch on it a little bit in my presentation. So I mean, I don't think there's a general answer to your question. You know, I mean, it seems like there might be some difference there. And some ethicists, like particularists in ethics, would argue that that's a crucial objection. You should never use thought experiments for that reason. You can't ever fully grasp the nuances of some moral situation until you're actually in it, you know. But I'm actually not in that camp. I think thought experiments are useful, can be useful if they're carefully constrained and carefully designed, and the experimental evidence seems to bear that out, as you'll see.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just continue, you know, because I think in the trolley problem, there's some thought
I think
that are not, whether you're framing or other perturbations of people's sense of what's going on in the experiment. Oh, crap.
All right,
Yeah.
I can hear you now. It's
Okay.
like every once in a while it happens. I do apologize.
Maybe you can
might
stop
be on
the
my end.
video. Maybe you can stop the video. Somebody suggested to save the bandwidth.
But how does she share slides then, Christine?
Slides. Well, but there's slides will be shared, but not the video. Less data over
Oh,
there.
I understand. Yeah. Maybe that's the best.
I could do that. Let me see if that works. Does that work?
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you definitely. With luck.
Can you see my slides?
Yep. We can see your slides.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's just continue like this, and maybe I'll pop back in if I have something important to point to make. Okay. All right. So that's the first part. I'm suggesting these just ethically aggregating and then implementing people's preferences would create an immoral machine for this reason. And just as an aside point here, AI system design is never value neutral. There's other problems with this moral machine experiment that I haven't even talked about. For example, they collected these kind of problematic ethical preferences about gender and class and age and body, but they didn't collect preferences about race or ethnicity or LGBT status, and they don't explain that or talk about it at all in the paper. So if you're going to collect one type of preference, you should collect every type of preference, or at least have some rationale for refusing to do one. You know, there needs to be some kind of, I mean, this is just an example of some implicit value decisions that were made in the paper that's trying to avoid making these kinds of decisions, but it's almost impossible to avoid values when you're creating these kinds of systems. So that's just in this slide. Okay, so the second section here, I'm going to kind of give you some background on how I'm going to cash out that intuition I mentioned about the moral equality of persons, and then use it, what this background I'm going to show you, to solve the trolley problem. Okay, so here's the moral machine experiment author's problem that we just looked at. How do we agree on the ground truth of what we ought to do, what a self-driving car or whatever ought to do, when us ethicists cannot get our acts together? So this is the question they asked in the paper. So given that we have these ethical disagreements that are unavoidable, how do we resolve our conflicts? Now, that is, how can one person's equal rights be reconciled morally with everyone else's in society? And this is precisely the problem that Immanuel Kant's political theory tries to solve. by contrast with the utilitarian political theory that maximizes the good. I kind of gave you the sample questions for these other approaches to political theory. And then a traditional social contractarianism like Hobbes. So how do we further our self-interest by uniting our powers? That would be Hobbes. We give up some freedom in order to benefit, that's the Hobbesian way. Whereas Kant, it's about respecting people. We want to interact with people morally. So, but it looks like we can't do that unless we can find a way to solve these problems of conflicts. That's the Kantian way to think about it. So our goal is respectful relations with other people for Kant. And the problem is this conflict cases like this, which seems to imply that we're going to have to treat people and we're going to have to violate their rights in some cases. So that's Kant's main question in his political theory. Let me just explain how Kant thinks about it and answers it. So this is the problem that Kant poses. We have this problem of moral conflict between equally free persons, humans in the state of nature. He calls it the state of nature, without any civil institutions. And first he starts out by saying that reason alone can't specify what our rights and duties are with respect to each other. We can't just reason that out. There's no a priori answer. So in a society where everyone is morally equal, each person has their own right to do what seems right and good to her and not to be dependent on someone else. That's an implication of just the equality of people. So even if everyone strives to act perfectly ethically and morally with respect to each other, wronging one another is inevitable since we have to interact as human beings. The reason is because when we have rights that conflict, there's no one to render any kind of make our duties with respect to each other determinate in a way that is legitimate. So basically, he concludes that moral relations, rightful relations, respectful moral relations with others are impossible in a state of nature. So his solution is to have a lawful authority in what Kant calls a civil condition. And here's what we need: a system of laws, which, because people affect each other, we need to be able to enter a rightful condition. But it has to be a will that unites. The laws have to be subject to a united will, so that when we're subject to them, we're not having our rights violated because there's a sense in which we are ourselves imposing a restriction on ourselves. So volenti non fit injuria. If you yourself restrict, if you restrict yourself, you're not harming yourself. If there's consent, there's no harm. So a united will is one that secures everyone's possible consent. And a public law is just, or legitimate actually, if and only if everyone could consent to it. That's Kant's standard. Well, it's a little bit contested, but that's the basic standard of justice for whether a law is legitimate or not, whether it could secure everyone's consent to it. So only a lawful public authority that sets out public laws that determine our rights, public laws that are legitimate, to which everyone could consent, can enable these rightful relations between persons. All right. So that's sort of the problem and his solution to that problem. The problem of moral conflict, the problem that moral relations are impossible in a state of nature, and the solution is lawful public authority. But it has a really important implication for us here, and it's called the priority of right. If we're committed to rightful relations with other people, then we have a duty to enter the civil condition and create a public authority, but we also have a duty to respect the determinations of that lawful public authority as to what our respective rights and duties are, even when we have private ethical preferences that might vary. And so there's a moral priority that the public authorities' determinations as to what our respective rights and duties are, is that those determinations are going to take moral priority over our private ethical judgments in these cases of conflict. And Kant says actually to reject lawful public authority and act according to your own private ethical preferences in conflict cases is to commit wrong in the highest degree, because you're rejecting the very basis of having respectful, rightful relations with other people. So we have a moral duty to enter into civil condition with others, and then to respect the authoritative laws of that public authority. So we have a moral duty to respect the judgments of lawful public authority in these conflict cases. So that's going to be really important here. So a moral machine, I argue, must be what I'm calling a rightful machine, one that respects the moral priority of principles of justice, the fundamental principles that without them would violate universal consent. That's what I mean by that. And the authoritative public laws of a legitimate state. So that's the background, the Kantian background here. So how does that help us resolve moral conflicts, such as in the trolley problem? So now I'm going to show you how to solve the trolley problem. I resort to that kind of idea. So here's the what's called the driver variation. First, I'm just going to explain what the trolley problem is originally, because there's sometimes some confusion as to what the problem actually is here. So Filippo Foot originally raised it in an article in 1967 that wasn't really even about the trolley problem specifically, but she posed this problem. She says, look, we got this driver variation where you're driving the trolley and the brakes have failed, and you can either, your only choices are either to maintain the lane, in which case you'll kill the 5 people ahead on the main track, or you can divert the trolley and you'll kill 1 person on the side track. So that's called the driver variation. There's that kind of case. And then Foot contrasted it with this kind of case where you're on a footbridge and the trolley, same trolleys, still the brakes have failed. It's a runaway trolley, and it will kill the 5 people on the track ahead. But now there's no side track. Instead, you're on a footbridge, and you could push this large man off and kill him, because the trolley would hit him and kill him. However, you would save the 5 people on the track by stopping the trolley. So there's that case. So here's the original trolley problem. In experiments, most people will say that they will turn the trolley in this case and in order to kill 1 to spare 5, but they say, no, I won't. We should not push. It's wrong to push the large man in this case, which is to spare 1. I mean, kill 1 to spare 5. So how can those moral intuitions both be rational at the same time? That's the trolley problem, the original trolley problem. And these intuitions in those 2 cases are extremely stable and consistent and resistant to framing and ordering effects. So about 90% are willing. About 90% of people say they would turn, or 80 or 90% say they turn, yet they will not push the large man in this case. How can those both be rational? Since in both cases you're killing 1 to spare 5. That's the trolley problem. Okay. So here's Filippo Foot's proposed solution. She says that negative duties, to avoid doing things, to not do things, that's why they're negative duties, are morally more important than positive ones, like helping people, aiding people. So in the driver case, there's a conflict between negative duties to avoid killing 1 versus avoid killing 5. And we prefer to violate fewer such negative duties. Whereas in footbridge, you have a negative duty to avoid killing the large man, and a positive duty to save or aid the 5. Then the negative duties are more important. So that's how she explains the trolley problem. And I think her analysis is roughly correct, but it's just not complete. And Thompson actually makes this point too. Judith Jarvis Thompson, who's probably better known for her papers on the trolley problem. And the reason why Foot's analysis is roughly correct is or rather is incomplete, is because the relevant distinction here is not between negative and positive duties, but between legal duties, lawful, public, authoritative duties, those duties that law prescribes, and ethical duties. Okay. So let's consider footbridge. You have a legal duty. This is when I say a legal duty, I don't just mean any legal duty. I mean one that's legitimately, it's a legitimate determination given by a lawful public authority. Okay, so Kant's a natural law theorist. So legal can sometimes sound like, possibly an illegitimate law or something to some people, some positivists about law. But let's just set that aside. So you have a legal duty not to kill the large man. That's why I call it a legal duty of right. I'm trying to get across that Kantian sense of the moral authoritativeness of law. So it's a legal duty right not to kill the large man by pushing him. That conflicts with an ethical duty of virtue to save the five by pushing the large man. So the priority of right controls. It's morally impermissible for you to push him because as a citizen, you're committed to rightful relations with people. And the legal duty here has been authoritatively determined by public law for precisely these kinds of conflict cases. So the priority of right controls this scenario. Morally, it's impermissible for you to push him, even if doing so would save five people, even if you would prefer to push him. So you contrast driver with footbridge. So here in driver, you again have a legal duty not to kill the one on the sidetrack. That's similar to the duty not to push the fat man. Large man. It's called fat man in the literature, but I don't think that's very nice. So I say large man. But here in driver, because you're the driver, you also have a legal duty to avoid killing the five by maintaining the course. So let me explain what I mean by that. The key of the driver variation is that you are the driver. So to see this legal duty that the driver has to avoid killing the five by maintaining lane, consider this choice. This is a scenario Judith Jarvis Thompson raised to illustrate that this legal duty exists. Here, the intuition is pretty clear. Most people look at this, that the driver has a legal duty to drive the car safely. That includes at least a duty to take reasonable care to avoid hitting and killing pedestrians. So if you could easily and safely turn the car and avoid killing or hurting anyone, and yet you choose to maintain your lane and plow through five people who are otherwise innocent, then it seems clear that you're violating some kind of duty to drive the car safely. So we don't know what the exact scope of this legal duty is. It's unclear, especially when turning might injure or kill someone, as in driver variation. But there is a legal duty here, and it's pretty important to recognize that. So there's an unresolved conflict between legal duties and driver. So the moral priority of right will not control the decision-making in driver. And I can talk about this more later, but minimizing harm is the most reasonable fallback ethical principle. And so for that most people fall back to. So it's rational to conclude that it's permissible to turn in driver. So that solves the trolley problem. The appeal to the priority of right and how it doesn't control driver, but it does control footbridge, solves the trolley problem. Moral intuitions, it's permissible to kill one to spare five in driver, but impermissible to do so in footbridge, are both rational, both rationally justifiable. And that solves the original form of the trolley problem. Okay. So let me know if you have any questions or anything. It's kind of strange. I can't see anyone's faces or see anything. So I'll just continue. So other trolley variations, there's a lot of literature on this. And there's lots and lots of variations of these trolley problems. They're trying to illustrate different things. And my contention is that almost all the other trolley variations are non-problems. And I think if you study the literature carefully, you'll see all kinds of problems with how these various scenarios are constructed and perceived. And I can talk about that some more. Like here's something from the top table was taken from a paper that's pretty influential in this area. And that paper referred to the table in the bottom from a different paper in order to generate. So the paper at the top was generating a system that would account for what these moral judgments are, which they put in a binary manner, as you can see. But if you look at the actual results from the experiments, like for example, the Oscar case corresponds to man in front. So Oscar is number 4. But only 62% of people said that decision was permissible. And then in the Ned case, which corresponds to loop, 48%, only 48, so, and they just lifted that and said, okay, that's impermissible. That's the moral judgment. But clearly that's a contested moral judgment in that case. So there's been a lot of weird things going on in this literature about how these cases have been sort of digested, what exactly we are having to account for. And I can talk about the reason why these intuitions are unclear in these other cases, if you'd like, in the Q&A. I'm not gonna do that here. The bystander in particular, which you've probably heard of, where you're actually standing on you're a bystander next to a lever, is a problematic trolley problem case where intuitions will shift based on framing effects. So it's just a bad thought experiment. I can talk about that later if you'd like. These other ones I also think are bad thought experiments for similar reasons. The only thought experiments that are good thought experiments are footbridge and driver. Those are the only ones that are stable and extremely consistent results. It's the only problem that we need to actually try to solve here, in my opinion. Okay, so how does this solution that I just gave, about that appeals to the priority of right, how does that help us resolve moral dilemmas more generally in the law and elsewhere? So here's what a moral dilemma is. It's just a conflict between narrow obligations. So this is a very simplistic rendering this, but sufficient to do A and. I'm sorry?
Your audio cut out, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now, or
Yep.
It's better now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But wait, there was a question in the chat. Maybe we should address that.
Okay, what about 5 adults on one track versus 5 children on the other? Yeah, there's all kinds of variations. I mean, that particular variation, if you want a kind of Kantian, I mean, when you bring in children into the trolley problem variations, then it complicates matters because adults have special duties to children, duties of care with regard to them that they don't have with regard to other adults necessarily, especially if you're a parent of the children, in which case, like for example, if you're if you have a child and you don't feed your child, and the child dies because of your neglect, then you're going to be guilty of murder. Whereas if you don't feed someone else's child, then you're not going to, and they die. That's unethical if you're aware of it, but it's not murder in the law. And so I think that's just one of the many confusions that often arise in these kinds of trolley problem cases that's rarely analyzed with care. So let's see, someone else had another chat. Let's see, 5 versus 1, okay. There's 6 versus 1. Yeah, once you got up to 5 versus, it really is interesting because once you get to 5 versus 1, I think I showed you in the results. And if it's just the dots they have there, as you add 1, 2, 3, 4, then you get to more confidence. And so it's 60 versus 20 there, when you get up to 4. And once you get above like sparing 1 to save 5, once you're saving 4 additional characters, I don't think it goes much higher. But I don't know if there's been a lot of experiments that push it further. They just found a very stable intuition. It gets up to about 90%. I don't know. It could go up. I don't think it ever gets up to 100%, if that's what you're asking. So as you can see, they did test just 1 extra character, 2 extra characters, 3 extra characters, 4 extra characters saved, and it progressively increases, but they didn't go beyond 4.
So that quandary about like whether you go back in time and kill Hitler to save millions of people, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about that. I mean, that would be, there's lots of different responses to that one. I think most people would say, yes, let's do that, right? But I think some ethicists will argue that even that's wrong. So, but yeah, I think even in the millions of people cases, there are some ethicists, some Kantians specifically, who would say, no, you can't do that even in that case. It's still murder, regardless of how good the outcomes might be. So there's a rational, defensible, ethical theory that would say you can't kill Hitler, even so. But that would be a very small group, I think, that would make that argument.
One question, by the way, if you saw what was on the chat, by Marchand again.
Yeah, that's the one I was trying. Oh, and there's a follow-up. Good. Okay, if there was a question about saving everybody versus saving 1 person, it might go to 100%. An existential thread. Oh, an existential thread. Okay, cool. Oh, let's see. Well, I still think I don't think it would go to 100%, just because I know philosophers who would break your universal quantifier there. So, it could go to very close to 100%, but there's a rational justification possibly for there. At least there's some philosophers think there's a reasonable case to be made that you can't kill someone. Alan Gewerth in particular would be someone like this. Although I met someone in conference.
I'm only maybe asking some. So I asked the question because based on what I read, that if there's existential threat understood in a way that the entire intelligent life would be destroyed, it's hard to talk about morality and about ethics if there is no sentient life anymore. So in a certain way, it is a special case where there is existential threat that may eliminate the entire all members of the intelligent species, but it's just based on one source, and you are the expert. It is
Actually-
why
Okay.
this is why I was interested if people actually try to quantify it and kind of measure how people are reacting to something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that familiar with that particular scenario or the existential threat.
So
But-
Ava, along the
yeah.
same lines, actually, like, what about, would you be willing to like kill 5 people to save yourself?
That, okay. Well, see, all these are very complicated questions, you know, from an ethical point of view. I mean, you can just say, what's your preference? That's one thing. But coming up with a rational answer, a rationally defensible answer, is a different matter entirely. And so, you know, that's what you have to do to justify a public law. And that is the key to solution of these kinds of problems. So a public law has to have some rational justification. It doesn't have to be the one, I mean, people can still disagree about it, but we have to have some rational adjudication of these kinds of cases that is one to which everyone could consent or could agree to. That's the basis of legitimacy of a law. But if the law is legitimate, it's not
By the way.
irrational, what is moral in those cases. I'm sorry?
You briefly cut out, I'm afraid.
Okay. Yeah, this is less than ideal here. So in a case where you're sacrificing yourself, you know, that's perfectly, I think it's perfectly, I mean, I think it's possible for you to consent to die to save other people. And so the law would not prevent you from doing that. Potentially, it could. It's also, you know, I mean, you could bar that kind of situation too legally, in which case, even if you wanted to do that, you couldn't. But we're kind of getting off the topic here. I mean, the main point I want to make here is that the law has this moral authority that will exert a priority over private ethical preferences. Like, you may be one of the 1% who thinks you should push, one of the 10% who thinks that it's ethical to push the large man off to save the 5 because that spares more lives. Nevertheless, because there's actually a constitutional right to life of the large man in the case, the moral thing for you to do would still be not to push the large man, even if that violates your own ethical preferences in the case. And even if that were the majority, even if the majority of people thought that you should push the large man, that doesn't matter if the law to which everyone consented and which went through a constitutional process to come about were that the large man cannot be pushed in such a case. Then that would be the moral decision, even if it conflicts with your own. That's the basic insight that solves the trolley problem, and which I think can be cashed out in dilemmas more generally, actually, in interesting ways. Does that help answer the question?
Mm.
No. Well, we got lots of questions now.
Mm.
Maybe I should.
But how do you design systems? How do you design cars? And why would people, you know, I mean, the question I was asking about whether or not you can sacrifice yourself to save others or not. I mean, that's a very real question about what kind of cars people will buy. If one Mercedes, you know, some expensive car maker is like saying, okay, oh, our algorithms will actually preference you, the driver.
Yeah. Well, right. So there's this question of whether people would buy, like, there does seem to be a difference in preferences. Like, it seems like people would prefer not to buy a car that would sacrifice them in these conflict cases. And yet, even if they say in some of these experiments that they think it would be right to do so, like sacrifice the passenger or the driver in order to save more lives, they may say that that's the right thing for a self-driving car to do in say, the moral machine experiment. In fact, they did find that. But no one's going to buy that car. So there's this kind of practical problem of actually marketing self-driving cars that these manufacturers are facing too. So there's that problem, that the ethical action, according to the moral machine experiment, may conflict with marketing kind of imperatives.
Well, but also as a consumer, what is and I want to be a responsible consumer, which car should I buy?
Maybe.
The thing
yeah,
is,
we can save this for the discussion.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm saying
But
that, yeah, since it's almost noon, let's try to not hold off, Ava.
Okay, I've just got a little bit. I'll just try to finish this last part, and then we can talk. And we can talk about the technical matters as well. But just let me finish the answer to that question. I think there's varying within the current legal regime. I think there's a number of different options right now. But I think public authority needs to address that kind of question that you're asking. And then once we have a kind of judicial or legislative or executive decision about that kind of problematic conflict case, then that would be the moral decision to make. See, that's kind of how this argument works. In these conflict cases, you have your own views. Everyone has your own views. We can vote and stuff. But we have processes that respect each other's rights in order to resolve these conflicts, and that we have to respect those processes. And when those processes do deliver a verdict or something, then that is what is moral in these decisions on a Kantian systematic deontological treatment of morality. That's the basic kind of insight here that I think is important. So, all right. So how does that insight help illuminate moral dilemmas or legal dilemmas more generally? So that's the next slide. I think I'm sharing my slide. Yeah. The slides are shared, aren't they?
Yep.
Still?
Could you
Okay,
stop
good.
your video feed just so it might avoid so your audio is better? Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay. So I'm starting off. This is a moral dilemma. You're obligated to do A and obligated to do not A. So that's what a moral dilemma is. And in this case, the duties are precise, simultaneous, and exclusive. So I'll define this as a dilemma. So how should rightful machines handle dilemmas in the law? Because they're going to come up. So I just return to Kantian concept of a lawful public authority. Only a lawful public authority can resolve our conflicts in ways that respect rights or have respectful relations. And a public law is just, like, regardless of anything else, it's legitimate, actually, if and only if everyone could consent to the law. So the basic principle of legitimacy and justice in Kantian deontology has these two demands that are going to be relevant to the resolution of dilemmas in the law. First of all, you can't just leave them unresolved. You can't just leave conflicting obligations unresolved in the law. The law has to be made consistent. Dilemmas indicate a failure of the law to fulfill its fundamental purpose of rightfully resolving our conflicts, first of all. And then second, if you enforce either obligation that applies to you without some rational resolution, like in a court, then that would be tantamount to coercion, since you can't consent to perform an action you take to be impossible. So if you have to do P and not, or have to do A and not A, you can't consent to perform an impossible action, A and not A. So we can't tolerate. So in other words, the application of that kind of law would be illegitimate to you. So that's the first demand that the principles of justice makes on the law is that these dilemmas have to be resolved. They can't be just left unresolved. The second one is that the obligations can't be enforced without a rational justice, because that's just what I was kind of talking about. There has to be some rational justification, because consent has a minimal requirement of rationality. There has to be some rational basis. You can't consent to a law that lacks any rational basis whatsoever. So the consent imports some minimal standard of rationality. So those are the two main demands that justice issues. And so let me just illustrate what I mean by that. So in driver, you have this conflict of legal duties. So in fact, driver is technically a dilemma case, as I posed it before. Foot gives a rational resolution by saying, oh, well, when you have this dilemma, in this particular kind of dilemma, we should just minimize harm. That's Foot's rational resolution. But justice does not, that's contested. Some people argue, as I mentioned, that you cannot turn the trolley regardless. So we can't just agree with Foot without reflection here, because that would be an ethical decision technically. So there's two varying ways to resolve driver here: to use ethical principles to fill out the public law, and one is to take up kind of a Foot's approach, which is to say, well, given that we're going to be intentionally killing someone regardless in driver, we ought to minimize the number of intentional homicides. Now, not lives lost, but intentional violations of rights lost. So it's a sort of consequentialism of rights here. So that's a consequentialist rationale that could inform public policy for this case. Alternatively, you might have a different kind of rationale. It's more ethically deontological rationale, and say that you should never impose an obligation to commit a murder ever, even when doing so is necessary to avoid committing more murders. You can't trade off rights like that. That's a kind of deontological insight. You could talk about that more if you like. So the law in that case would be that the driver has an option. It's up to the driver. The law would permit the driver to turn or not turn. But these are two different public policy choices that the law could make in this particular driver dilemma case that have an ethical basis, a rational ethical basis. And that just illustrates this general idea about the law's status that from Chief Justice Earl Warren. I like this quotation: law floats on a sea of ethics. So law, the purpose of law is to negotiate our ethical conflicts by in ways that allow us that meet the requirement that we respect each other as moral persons. But whatever policy we make in a case like driver, like a pure dilemma case, we have to have some rational adjudication. We can't just leave it floating out there. And then I can talk about how the law might process the two ethical rationales I just gave in the previous slide. There's actually different theories in the law that could capture those rationales. The model penal code permits a necessity defense across the board. That would apply here. It would allow you give you a moral option in the case, versus this Dudley versus Regina rule. It's in common law. It bars necessity as a defense to a charge of homicide, and so you would not be able to turn the trolley according to the Dudley rule. It's more the common law or traditional rule. But whatever policy we make, we have to have some policy. You can't just throw people in these situations and then punish them, because that would violate basic standard of universal possible consent. Okay. So the way that a rightful machine should handle dilemmas is it needs to be able to act in a way that's at least potentially reflects consistent set of applicable enforceable law, and then it needs to make some choice. So we need a legal reasoner as a component inside of these sort of rational agent architectures. That's how I'm conceiving it. And this legal reasoner would basically generate consistent sets of law that it would then be required to submit to maybe an executive rational control agent to make a decision, and possibly in consultation with an external oracle, like a human, and maybe in some cases. But it's really interesting here. I think this is an interesting outcome of this analysis. The dilemmas really aren't that different from other conflicts between moral rights and duties from the point of view of justice, because whether there's such a thing as tragic conflict between our ethical duties that we might have towards one person or 5 people, doesn't really matter from the point of view of law. We have to have a resolution if we want to be able to enforce any kind of obligation on anyone. We need some sort of resolution, and it has to be a minimally rational one. So I think that's a really interesting outcome because it helps solve this problem of tragic conflict too. This is probably a bigger problem in philosophy, is this tension between the demand for consistency and the requirements that we enforce on people and the possibility that our duties could come into tragic conflict with each other. So, and then these are just the conclusions of the paper. So I kind of just summarize. So first of all, let's just brief very quickly and then I'll be done. So I think if we take the moral machines approach and we just aggregate raw ethical preferences from like surveys or polling, we end up with what I would think is an immoral machine that doesn't respect people as moral persons because it would violate their equal rights of freedom in certain cases, like trolley problem cases. So a moral machine has to be a rightful one that respects the moral priority of principles of justice and legitimacy, the public law of a legitimate state. If it's going to act morally, then it has to act rightfully. That's what a rightful machine is. And then I argue that the priority of right rationally justifies the prevailing moral intuitions in driver versus footbridge, and that solves the trolley problem. And then I illustrated, or talked about how this rationale for the priority of right illuminates how we should handle dilemmas more generally in the law and perhaps across moral theory. So thank you all so much. I have a bunch more about the technical side of this that we could talk about if you like as well, how to implement these normative ideas in an actual system. But I think that's probably where we'll have to stop today since we're out of time here. So thank you.
Thank you again, Ava. Since it's a little afternoon, if people have to leave now, they're free to. Right now, we'll be doing a brief group Q&A where anyone who had questions earlier are free to ask them now. I especially want to bring attention to Christina, whom I had to cut off before. Christina, you're free to ask your question. I do apologize for having to cut you off before.
Just from practical. Hi, Ava. Actually, we met at AIS in February.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
Right before COVID hit, in New York City. The last weeks of normalcy that we had, although it wasn't normal. AAAI at the time was not normal. So many people from China not being able to come travel.
That's true. Actually, it was kind of strange, but it was fun. I had a really good time there.
I had a couple of questions. Well, one
okay.
like saying what is the responsible consumer going to do? Somebody wants to be responsible, wants to be moral and just. How should they? What choice should they make in buying a car? Like what kind of car would you buy personally?
So you're posing a question where, say, someone like Tesla or somebody created a car that would kill 5 people rather than kill you.
Yeah.
And you say, is that moral to, so what you're really, I mean, that's a little bit different a question, because I don't think the law has adjudicated that what you're talking about is a situation where the law has a gap or has not been addressed in the law. I don't know if Tesla, I mean, we have to decide together whether, let's say that happens. Tesla's car, I don't know exactly how Tesla's car, I don't mean to pick on Tesla here, but let's just say a self-driving car chooses to kill 5 people rather than to kill a passenger. Now, there's at least a legal theory of responsibility for a wrongful death lawsuit, at least, that could be that Tesla could be subject to in such a case. I don't know if that's been litigated, so it's still an outstanding issue in the law. It could even possibly be a criminal reckless. I mean, I would be open to a criminal. I mean, personally.
But the responsibility would go to the maker, not the consumer, the buyer of the.
Well, I think the buyer could also bear some possibly some legal responsibility, especially if they're aware that that's a decision that Tesla has made and then they purchase and own the car. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions as to who is responsible when autonomous systems like that harm people, because it's responsibility gap, so it's called. So is it the owner? Is it the manufacturer, or the builder, designer?
Yeah,
those questions always come up, but I think there's potential responsibility.
I would assume that even if it's a different context, that there's analogies one can make with, for example, gun ownership. Like if let's say a gun manufacturer knowingly allowed guns to be sold to terrorists or to Mexican cartels. Is it the Mexican cartels who are responsible for killings, let's say, or is it the gun manufacturer? I mean, I guess in some sense, it's really the even if the car manufacturer is sort of separated from that moral decision, they are presumably knowing that their car is a sort of a part of that chain of events that leads to some moral action.
Yeah, I think in the case we just talked about, the car maker must have, I mean, this is a totally hypothetical case. The car maker clearly chose to make this decision that its car would kill more people rather than the driver in these kinds of conflict cases. And in which case, I think there could very well be certainly ethical responsibility on the car maker's part, and possibly legal response. They are aware of the decision they're making in that case. So it's all you need is reasonable foreseeability in civil cases, but in criminal cases you got to have awareness, and so there could very well be criminal liability if a car maker makes the wrong decision here. So.
There is already some liability, no? If you design a building which has flaws and that building collapses and kills people, you are liable for those deaths. So
yeah,
maybe we could draw the similarity line here with the car designers too.
Right. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, in the scenario we just proposed, the car maker foresaw this situation and made an explicit decision. In the building case, it looks like someone's just being negligent. They didn't intend for the building to fall down. So they'd be civilly liable, but not criminally liable, probably, depending on how bad their negligence was. But in general, negligence requires, I mean, in general, criminal culpability requires a certain awareness of what's going on, not mere stupidity or unreasonableness. That's the line between criminal and civil law. So it's that the analogy would not be there in this case, but it might be in some other case for the car if it's just poorly designed, like they didn't even think about the fact that it might end up in these kinds of conflict cases, then that could be negligent. Yeah.
So to resolve this, what do we need? Laws? Do we need our legal system to create new laws? Do we need our software engineering to change how they're doing it? I mean, how do we resolve this?
How does this come out? Yeah. Well, that's what I tried to kind of address in that last part. Yes, the answer is that we do need authoritative resolutions of these kinds of situations. And that's part of why there's so much just kind of distress over these issues right now, is because we have not.
Mhm.
We don't have an authoritative, like we haven't decided as a society what we want cars to do in a legitimate manner. So it's just being thrown into the hands of a bunch of people who really don't have the authority to make these decisions for everyone. We do need a public law about some of these cases. I do think that's correct. And so a lot of what machine ethicists do, in my opinion, is that we try to inform what that decision should be by articulating various possible ethical rationales that are defensible and justifiable. So it's a project that we need to do together as a society. We need to decide. What we're going to decide to do as a society, what cars should do in these kinds of cases. We can't just leave it. I do think it violates people's rights and is basically an immoral kind of, intolerably immoral situation to not have some kind of authoritative resolution of the worst kinds of cases that these cars might face, at least. So yeah, that's the basic answer. But what should we do in terms of programming them? Is that what you're asking? While we're in this messy situation and we don't know what's going on?
Yeah, what is the responsibility of programmers is one question. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I suggest in the more technical part of my presentation, I didn't talk about, but I suggest that what these rightful machines, how they should operate. Well, first of all, they have to recognize that these decisions that touch on people's rights are different and of a higher priority than decisions that don't. And specifically when there's conflicts in conflict cases. And the machine needs to be able to act in a manner that is at least potentially rational, so it needs to be able to grapple with conflicts in the law by creating consistent, separate, possibly consistent sets of laws that it would then act in accordance to. So in other words, there'd be a kind of de facto ethical option for a maker of a rational agent. So, like in the example I gave you where of the trolley driver case, there were two rational ethical ways of grappling with that decision. And the rational agent would choose between consistent sets of laws, essentially. So what the legal reasoner part of the machine would do is it would generate like alternative options that make legal sense in some way. Like, yeah, you could turn the trolley on this set of laws and inferences that make sense together on this coherent set, or you could not turn the trolley on this coherent set of laws that I know about that apply here. And then some other component in the system could very well, at that point, it doesn't, from the point of view of right and justice, it doesn't matter which set the machine acts in accordance to.
But it seems to me that's
So
sort of the main issue that I have a problem with. I think I very much agree with your conclusion that the rightful machine should abide by, you know, the given laws as much as possible, and that new laws need to be created to deal with some of the situations like the ones that, you know, Christina was outlining. But I don't think that you will ever have, you know, even if you have the most perfect AI, that you will have legal reasoners that will basically be able to apply highly imperfect laws that today take, you know, months and year-long court cases to lead to interpretations in, you know, microseconds where they have to make a decision. So I think in the end, you will always wind up with some ambiguity. And the question is what to do with that ambiguity. Are you basically just saying at that point, just make a random choice? Or is there some other principle that should guide you?
well, I mean, there's a couple of different questions you're asking. I think you're asking. So you're specifically talking about ambiguity.
I'm first of all saying I don't think you can actually design a legal reasoner that will come up with these consistent choices, because the difficulty about applying the law is interpreting it relative to a specific situation.
Okay.
The laws
So
itself are very, very abstract, but actually figuring out how that law applies to, you know, that particular traffic crossing and everything that's going on there, that's the difficult part.
Okay. So that's good, because those are two. So those were two different questions. I was wondering if you were asking that. So that question, that's a really old kind of question in conflict in moral theory. It's sometimes referred to as the problem of relevant descriptions, or the problem of judgment. Kant refers to it as the problem of judgment. And I actually think that Kant has a solution to that problem. Specifically, the problem is that laws are rules, just rules of any kind, are given in a kind of indeterminate, in some sense. They have to leave some room for application in particular circumstances. So there's a sense in which rules are always a little bit abstract, always abstracted from the situations in which they apply, whereas actions are determinate in particular to the situation in which they are. So how is it that a rule, how do you apply a rule at all? You know, that's one philosophical question. But then it becomes a more difficult question when you think about how is a machine going to apply a rule. Some people argue that machines could never apply any kind of rule because of this problem, just in a general sense. So there's that problem. Then there's also the problem of conflicts between laws generating indeterminacy as to the action required. So those are two separate kind of problems. So it looks like you were asking kind of both at the same time. I mean, they both relate.
Yes.
Conflict generates indeterminacy, as well as this kind of general problem of abstraction or something. Now, Kant's solution to that problem, this is a paper that I'm actually working on right now because it relates to this project. One of the implications of the requirement of possibly universal consent is that it's not possible to consent to a law that isn't precise enough to specify what action it is that you're supposed to do in some situation. So Kant requires laws to be legal duties of what he calls duties of right, to be precisely specified. And they have, normatively speaking, they have to be specified precisely enough for an agent to know what to do, to know how they apply in some particular situation. So a law that is not precisely specified enough is not a legitimate law on this standard. So let me give you an example. So in ethics, there's a general duty of beneficence to help other people. This is one of Kant's imperfect duties. But it's, you know, helping other people is too broad to be legally enforceable, because you don't know what action specifically, you can't enforce it in any specific situation. Because the action is not determinate enough, you know. So we have this rule to help other people, but in that case, that could never be a legally enforceable, a rightfully enforceable law, because it's too vague. Whereas in some state jurisdictions, we do have easy rescue cases. There are some efforts to enact parts of this rule of beneficence. And in those jurisdictions, they'll say things like you're required to, if you're in a car accident and someone's injured, then they require you to call the police or an ambulance. And if you don't, then you're subject to criminal or civil penalties. So the law that specifies what to do in that kind of case is very specific. It's precise enough to solve the problem you're suggesting might be a general one for these machines. And given the argument I just made about how I think the most important rules that these machines are often going to have to respect are going to be these duties of right, these legal rules that are rightfully enforceable. Those rightful machines are going to be subject to those kinds of rules. And so this normative requirement that those rules have to be precise is going to solve a lot of this problem, the one you're raising. So the legal rules that are applied to machines are just by definition going to be precise enough to apply. So I don't think that machines are necessarily, I mean, they are now. Right now, humans have far more, obviously, more judgment about how to apply a legal rule, than a machine. But I don't think that's a necessary limitation of a machine. That I mean, the laws that apply, like stop when the stoplight is red. I mean, it's very precise. It's precise enough. So it has to be enforceable. So I think that.
No,
that
so
answer that
I
question.
don't want to
So-
hijack the conversation here, but so I agree. You can sort of raise the bar on this. You can write better laws that are more specific. I'm just saying, practically, if that were the case today, we barely would need any court proceedings because it would all be abundantly clear what the legal outcome should be. But instead, there's a lot of argumentation and reliance on precedent and interpretation going on. So it's far from very specific from going from the laws to the actual, then in the end, sort of legal consequence. And so, humans are imperfect legal reasoners. When I'm in that situation, I make some kind of judgment based on some whatever agglomeration of legal and moral and self-preservation, whatever cost functions, if you will. And in the end, somebody might say, well, that's the wrong decision because, and I have to go through a court case and maybe they send me to jail because I violated something. and in the end, I think for the machines, even though, if they are, whatever, have more at their disposal, they might actually be able to be better legal reasoners in such a short amount of time. But in the end, it just seems to me impractical to sort of require that you have to do this sort of to perfection. There will always be some aspect that you just can't, So as I said, you can sort of raise the bar, make better laws and so on. But this ambiguity, it seems to me, you'll never get completely away from. Anyway, I mean,
Well,
you don't have to, it is a very interesting, question. So, but I don't want to hijack the discussion. So you don't
No, it's a
necessarily
really
have to
great
answer
question. I'm
this.
interested in it. Thank you for asking it. It's I mean, I'm working on something related right now, so I think that's really great. But I just want to point out that, I mean, you underestimate your ability to follow the law. I mean, I think the cases that get so much attention are the really hard cases. That's why they get all the attention. But for most regular kinds of interactions with the law, you know exactly what to do and you do it. There's not going to be an adjudication. The adjudications occur when there's real conflicts, and those are the cases that attract all the attention. But the vast majority of cases are not like that. So of actual circumstances you're going to run into. So I think machines will, I mean, in general, our regime of law is not rife with conflicts. And when conflicts arise, then there's a problem, and it does end up being adjudicated. That's true. But those are the unusual situations. Those are not the norm. So that's just one point to make there.
Yeah, I was going to be, well, I kind of agree with both ideas. For Hans, I do see ways in which there might be a lot of edge cases, but I really do appreciate your point, Ava, that I mean, I'm just thinking, while there may well be edge cases, which is the whole reason why sort of court system, the huge court system exists, I'm also thinking, you know, let's say I've driven thousands of hours in the car over the course of my life, you know, and in no time, you know, speaking of self-driving cars, if a self-driving car were to do the same, I think, as far as I know, every one of those minutes within all those hours, there was no moral ambiguity, right? So, you know, there might have been mistakes. Let's say I ran a stop sign or something silly like that, but that the morality was fairly clear. So perhaps when there are edge cases, those could be decided through some legal means. So it's not to say that AI will solve it completely. There will always be edge cases, but maybe in an automated sense, it could probably work for the majority of cases. That sounds reasonable.
Yeah, I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, I think that's a good point to make. I mean, yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. I actually, if you want to see, I mean,
Oh, we can't hear you right now. You just cut out.
this is an interesting
Ava, we just lost you for about
as are
20
all the
seconds.
conflict cases, right? This is in one of his papers. We have a killer to punish the person because they're a killer, but obligated on. So how? And you can't use standard deontic logic because you get an explosion of inferences. Instead,
Oh,
I
wait,
see.
Ava, we lost you for about 20 seconds. So could you
Yeah.
repeat what you were just saying right when you started sharing the screen?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you can have this case where you have a killer who's a minor, and so you're obligated to punish the killer, but obligated not to punish the person because they're a minor. So you can have both a killer and minor. So you end up with this conflict between you're obligated to punish the person and you're obligated not to punish the person, right? So that's a dilemma. This is Carlos Alceron's case that he examines. And he comes up with his belief revision logic, AGM, you may have heard of it, to handle cases like this. But I argue that, and I explain how you can't use standard deontic logic to handle these kinds of cases because there's an explosion of inferences from the contradiction. And I argue in my paper that you can use a non-monotonic reasoning system with a credulous reasoning semantics. And what that kind of system does is it creates, and then I implement it in answer set programming. What it does is it gives you sets of valid law that's consistent that provides a rightful machine with answers to its conflict cases. And then I cache that out in the driver variation and in the footbridge variation. So that's what I do. So in other words, this is how the rightful machine will handle these edge cases, these conflict cases you were talking about. You know, where you have a case where it looks like you're under an obligation to help people, or like in driver, it looks like you're under an obligation to turn, an obligation not to turn. So if you can come up with a non-monotonic reasoning system that can sort of cut out consistent sets of laws that that the machine could then choose between, it can act in a rightful way, even in the edge conflicted cases where we have no publicly authoritative determination as to what the thing is supposed to be doing. So it can still act kind of rightfully by respecting some of these basic principles of stability and consistency and rationality of the law, and how it operates by at least having options like this, options of consistent action, consistently rightful action. So I don't know. that was a really rapid too rapid description there. I don't know if that was super relevant, but
That was quite helpful.
was it actually? Was it actually? Okay.
But in the meantime, I just want to say for those who are left, are there any other questions that people have?
I just have one brief comment, on that answer set programming. So, this sort of, similar types of non-monotonic logics used to be my area of business some long time ago. The difficulty there is to setting up the problem, again. So, I mean, obviously you have to have the reasoning to sort of make the legal choices, but actually coming up with the formulation of the problem from the situation that you're in, that's going to be the challenge for a machine. So, and that might be a more difficult challenge than the actual reasoning problem itself.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really significant challenge. However, again, this is kind of one of the interesting things about my whole approach here is that, again, it's less challenging than it would be if it were not specifically a legal kind of question. Because laws, by their nature, rules they're gonna have very specific elements to fill out, like even a murder. Murder is intentional homicide, killing of a human being without defense or excuse. So you got you have cause, and then a human, and then intentionality. I mean, the law gets very specific about what it is that the machine would have to try to pick out in its particular circumstances. And I agree, that's really difficult. But again, I think it's not. It seems more superable than it would be otherwise because of how I'm restricting the context to be not even just law, but rightfully enforceable law. So law that has this precision, so I don't know, you may be right that that's going to be impossible for machines to actually ever, but actually I think there's actually I mean there's working systems that have some degree of like a belief, desire, intention, rational agent architecture kind of robotic systems that have like rules of the air or something, like a autonomous unmanned aerial vehicle or something will have rules of the air that constrain its behavior. I think there's actually, I mean, I don't think these things are impossible to grapple with.
No, I'm not saying it's impossible. I mean, there's humans that do that today in some form. I think they have an advantage because their reasoning is not subject to inspection. The machines will have some kind of audit trail, so we will know what they did.
Yeah.
But we have examples of legal reasoners that do this in these situations. So I don't think it's going to be impossible. But just sort of from a machine and sort of formal perspective, all I'm saying is challenging. I'm not saying
it's difficult. Yeah, I agree that is mostly a perceptual problem. You're trying to perceive the morally salient objects and aspects of your situation. Like that's a tree, that's a person. I mean. But trying to determine whether something is intentional or something causes something else, that's hard. I really do agree with that. I haven't actually tried to really grapple with that part of this project yet. I don't know. That seems almost like something that's downstream from what I'm doing. I'm operating at this very knowledge representation level where I kind of just stipulate a lot of the facts in these answer set programs that I've been trying to write and play with. And answer set programming is only one option, by the way, that could cash out this kind of deontic logic that I'm proposing. There could be a belief revision system like Alteron's, or just a default logic of some other kind that would work, I think, too. I'm just suggesting that these non-monotonic reasoning systems can respect the normative constraints that I'm proposing on Rightful machines and on the wall. So.
Great. Thank you, Ava. Are there any other questions? All right. In that case, thank you again for your time, Ava, and we will have one-on-one discussions later in the afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. This is fun. I really love talking about this. So.
Oh, and before we leave, I just wanted to mention you have the Zoom link for the one-on-one meeting, which is not the same as this Zoom link, right?
Right. Yeah, I have a nice email from what's her name?
Me.
Amy.
Me.
Yeah. Okay. They did not. Okay, you're not Amy though. But yeah,
No,
you're
she's
filling
on
in.
vacation. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Yeah. So I'll just follow those Zoom links then for the next steps here, I guess.
All right. Great. All right. Well, I'll see you later. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you all so much. Bye. Have a nice break.
And Ava, don't turn the link